Good afternoon. It is such a pleasure to have you here with me today. Welcome to Understanding Decolonization, Race and Global Philanthropy. My name is Dana François, and we're going to have a great conversation today. And I do urge you, as you're coming in, please put your name, organizations in the chat so that we know who's here and we can engage in a conversation. If you have any resources that come to mind, do share it with your peers who are listening to the conversation today. And with that, we'll get started. So before we jump right in, I wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the session goals today. So we're going to look at the root causes of really the work that we do. We're going to understand what's the connection that race has to do with decolonization and our work in philanthropy, and understand the root causes that really impact not just our work, the communities where we work, and the importance that they have in the legacy of colonization and slavery. So it's an invitation to, although we'll talk about some challenging issues, it's really an invitation to lean into it and not to fear, in the words of Toni Morrison, but in fact to be energized and galvanized and to really pick up the tools and tips that we come up with today to see how do we move forward and how can we be more effective in our work in global philanthropy. So with that said, we'll go over the current trends to understand really the patterns of inequality structurally that exist, that shape the communities where we work, and that shape, really broadly speaking, development work. We'll look at the colonialism, slavery, and race as root cause that shape the system of inequity that communities are facing and are addressing across issues. We'll think about neocolonialism in development, and really neocolonialism is the later stage of colonialism, and we'll see what that means and its importance in understanding our work in philanthropy and understanding the work that is happening in communities where we work and the connection to race and power. And we'll also think about the role and opportunity for philanthropy. Within this particular piece of the conversation, we'll have an opportunity to look at a model that really shows us the impact of these structured and historical legacies on, in this particular case, food systems, so that it really lands for us the importance of systems of inequities, not just as a global framework, but as framework that have had specific and direct impact on the communities and in the countries where we work, that all have in common that race is one of the key factors that cuts across. So before getting started, I really wouldn't want to miss the opportunity to lift up François, who is really considered one of the foremost writers in decolonization, and whose work has influenced the field and colonial studies across the world and really has inspired social movements. He talks about cognitive dissonance, which is a very, very important piece to highlight today. As we will enter and we'll dig into some very contentious issues, it is normal as human beings to, particularly if any of those things are challenging any belief that we hold, any notions that we hold, to feel as though we're in conflict. And I invite you to sit with that. I invite you to turn into wonderment. Those of you who know of the concept of brave space, and we'll share a resource related to that. It invites us to face the truth with courage, knowing that if we face the truth and we know the truth, then we can change it, to paraphrase James Baldwin. And lastly, related to assumptions, it's key that we are clear as to the analysis that we'll make today, the limits and where that analysis is anchored. It will be rooted in the history of colonization, race, and slavery, how they shape communities, how they shape the world, how they shape the work that philanthropy is engaged in, how they shape really even our effectiveness as a sector. We'll also look at particularly the perspective of European and kind of American imperialism and growth over the years, and the power dynamics that shape the field and the sector. We'll also look at particularly geopolitical and economic perspectives, because again, as we think about colonization and we later talk about decolonization, it is highly important to understand that these structures have shaped and redefined entire countries and communities and people. And it's critical that we understand the ways in which these different pieces intersect, so that in our work as philanthropy and as actors in the sector, we know what lever to press on, we know how to be effective, and importantly, we understand the dynamics of race related to these factors. With that, we'll get started. So I will invite you to take a look at this quote from Uzodinma Iwala, who is the CEO of the Africa Center, and he's a foremost writer who's wrote about these issues in many times. And his quote is really symbolizing and synthesizing much of the conversation that has been resurging over the last 2 to 3 years related to the effectiveness of, broadly speaking, development, the effectiveness of philanthropy, the role that power comes into play, the role that colonization and decolonization plays related to not just philanthropy, but essentially the work in the sector. And he's speaking to a key element that I wanted to particularly highlight as we think about those issues, but also think about the opportunities, is really the notion that unless philanthropy rethinks some of the way that it works as a whole, we recognize that amongst us, many of us are engaged in addressing racial justice work in a number of different ways, in addressing decolonization work in a number of different ways, but collectively as a sector working in this field in partnership with racialized communities, unless we really think about how we leverage our resources, our tools, in our approaches in a way that shifts these power dynamics in an effective way, then we do in fact run the risk of undermining the very impact that we seek to have. And this is at cross purposes to philanthropy's original intent. And it is important to highlight this. And the reason why that is, it's because particularly when we know that philanthropy as a field is rooted in the notion of the love of humanity, and really the shaker and first mover who's looking at root causes of issues, it really behooves philanthropy to take the time to think about these issues so that we can collectively, hopefully in our lifetime, see changes related to patterns that affect patterns of inequity that are historical, deeply rooted, currently present, and particularly affect racialized communities and countries of particularly Black, Latinx, and Asian populations throughout the world. So as we think about the current trends, as I shared earlier, to really ground us in terms of where we're finding ourselves now, we can see that global North countries, and this is a broad definition to really mean essential leading industrial countries who also happen to be, for the most part, former colonizing countries. Global North countries have seen significant growth in GDP. And GDP is not necessarily a great measure of human development, as the Human Development Index is, as an example, but it speaks to the productivity of a country. It speaks to its economic activities, dynamism, and you can imagine what that means related to resources, related to what may be possible in a dynamic society, in a dynamic community who's producing. So we can see that if anything, there's a growing gap over the last 50 to 60 years between global North countries and global South countries. And global South, again, it's a bit of a loaded term, very arbitrary term that essentially means, for the most part, Black and brown and Asian countries, really. And these tend to be also former colonial, colonized countries, and that are today are really finding themselves in similar patterns vis-a-vis the global North. So there's a question that this raises for us as to, one, why is that? Why do we see this pattern? And secondly, what does that mean for us in philanthropy? What does that mean related to outcomes across the board that we're trying to reach? And as I've highlighted earlier, related to economic power, we know that that has a significant impact in terms of what's possible. So knowing that we're currently all facing the devastating impact of COVID-19 globally, these patterns, again, are replicated. We all have talked and discussed about frontline workers, right? About people in communities of color being at the front line, but yet having the least resources and the least support related to the impact of COVID-19 on this population. Well, we see a similar pattern for, again, typically Black and Brown countries and in some Asian countries related to who has access to resources to acquire vaccine, decide what vaccine that they need, and decide how soon to get it. So this matters related to what countries are able to do. And this trend that we saw is a trend that we also see related to where power and where resources are concentrated in the quote unquote global north. For the last 10 years, really, starting in 2000, over 10 years, almost for 20 years at this point, we can see that the leading countries where most of the funding is coming from to go into quote unquote global south countries are, again, the same players. It's the United States, European countries, Canada, Sweden, Japan. So again, we see a pattern of where resources are allocated, where resources are coming from, and yet another pattern also that emerges in spite of all of this investment, again, not to minimize a lot of the progress that we've seen across issues in our work, but collectively, I think that what a lot of communities are elevating and what we've been reading related to the effectiveness of the sector over the last few years is that as a whole, many of the issues that we've been collectively addressing, there's a lot more work that has left to be done, and the patterns are continuing in the same direction. And again, we see a pattern across race in terms of who fares the worst. Again, it's Black communities, Latinx communities, and Asian communities, as we can see, related to children who are poor. And this is a pattern that exists within industrialized societies, but also throughout the world related to communities and countries that tend to be former colonial countries and that have the largest population of Black, Brown people, and Asianx population. Again, the same pattern is also the pattern that we see with philanthropic dollars in terms of significant philanthropy. And we know why when we know about particularly US private philanthropy, European philanthropy, institutionalized philanthropy in terms of where it's originating. But again, it's really showing you the patterns of where the resources are sitting and kind of where the resources are going. We don't see in this list any of these quote unquote southern countries as being a major contributor to philanthropy. And these patterns have particular impact related to how the funding of flow evolves, related to who gets to decide, related to the global trends, and really how do we address who leads the work in those communities. So as we know, less than about 3.1% of all spending, again, following these patterns, go to national local organizations. And most of these resources tend to go to large international organizations who are based in, broadly speaking, the global north, as we've come to call it. And tied aid is particularly, and aid is broader than philanthropy naturally, but giving the importance of aid as a sector and the ways in which, broadly speaking, it's shaped communities and it's shaped really foreign policy, as we'll see later, related to how this impact is felt by communities and countries. There's very little distinction as to really what is kind of the honest on philanthropy versus broader aid. So that's one of the reasons why we're kind of talking about them jointly, because the effect is really felt jointly. So tied aid is really this concept by which countries have an obligation to make sure that the funds that are allocated to aid is in majority going back to institutions of that said country. It's a pattern in the United States. It's a pattern in other Am I back? Thank you. So it is a pattern that we see in many places. And yet again, although we do know that most of the effect, the success that we've seen tend to happen when local government, when they're effective, when there's good governance, local government is most effective, civil society is most effective at seeing results, and local NGOs are more effective at seeing results, yet they see typically less than 2% of the resources that are allocated, broadly speaking, across aid and philanthropy. So against this background, before we get into really going back into kind of the root causes of these patterns that we're seeing, and thinking about colonization as a historical fact that has shaped the world and shaped those patterns, there are two frameworks that we'll use today that are very helpful and really kind of tying the kind of the larger structures and really these global patterns with very specific impact. So it's dependency theory, and it's essentially a framework that emerged in the 1950s under the UN Commission for Economic Development in Latin America, and it emerged as an attempt to answer the question as to why, even in 1950s, the patterns that could be observed during colonial times related to who has power, who has resources, are the same patterns that we're seeing in the 1950s. So that's where this framework emerged from, and it's very helpful to kind of connect the dots. And then the second framework that's also very important, knowing that everything that we're discussing has a clear racial bend to it, is John Powell's framework of spheres of systemic racialization. And one of the reasons why this framework is so helpful, it's because it really delineates the different levels of analyses. The internalized piece, which is really the person in terms of your own beliefs, and knowing that people's beliefs then impact interpersonal relationships. As human beings, we build institutions with our knowledge and our beliefs, and eventually these institutions and the law really lend themselves to structures that particularly impact the systems that we're trying to address. So these are the two frameworks that we'll use for our analysis today. And before we jump right in, we'll pause for a few minutes for any questions and comments that you may have, and for a bit of a conversation. And let's see, there is one question. As holders of unjustly acquired dominance power, how do we responsibly phase ourselves out while creating the parallel liberating systems that are designed and led from equity and justice, not abdicating to utter unjust power? This is the million-dollar question, right? But this is exactly the right question that we need to ask. One of the kind of pieces of answer that I would share is really taking the time as we think about philanthropy, realizing that there are different levels of actions that are critical. On one level is really thinking about our institutions in terms of how our policies, approaches, are they undermining the systems and structures actively? If we're thinking about this notion of the urgency that's raised with this question, our approaches and systems are actively supporting decolonization, because these structures that we'll see in a minute were constructed. So how do we deconstruct them so that something else can take shape? So that's the one piece there. And what does that mean? And that's across different levels, right? It's across governance. How are our board thinking about this? How are we using and leveraging our investment tools to advance resources that are transformative and that yield to systems change? And how do we do this with urgency? And how do we avoid getting in our way? And more importantly, I think it's very key to remember that the expertise lies in communities. And unless we're shifting power by sitting space at the table and by providing resources so that these solutions can take root, then there's very little chance for these changes to take place. But we'll see towards the end of the conversation today a few more strategies that many are using in philanthropy to address this very question. Thank you. Oh, and second question, what resources or suggestions do you have for donors who have anxiety about sending funds directly to organizations on the ground? This can be a challenge when people are distrustful of local banking systems, and yet it is a huge barrier to supporting locally led initiative. The first thing that I will say, this is absolutely critical to do. It is absolutely critical to, so the first thing I would say is, yes, it's important to do. Now, how do we figure this out? There are a number of different reasons why, or a number of different barriers that get in the way of actually doing so. One of them is, how do we perceive risk as philanthropy? Thinking about the notion of philanthropy as a first mover. Is this truly how we see ourselves? And that's where I think a lot of the reflection related to who we are as philanthropy, what is the role that we can play, and the role that we choose to play is really at the heart of this question. Because the moment that there's a decision that philanthropy can and must play that role, because it can absorb more risk, really, compared to, as an example, government, compared to, as an example, the financial system, the moment that we accept that philanthropy can play that role, then it gets to, how do we play it effectively? How do we look at capacity building of local institutions in a way that there is an exit strategy, that capacity building doesn't last for 20 years and we see no impact on that. So I would urge you to stick with this particular question, because it is key. It needs to happen, and really think about, how do I define risk? Where do I feel fear? Why do I feel this fear? What's the difference between perception and reality? And how do you engage with local actors so that they can provide the solutions that many times we may not be seeing in philanthropy to advance the work in a way that is effective? And again, please do share in the chat if others have other ideas. And there's some strategies, again, that we'll discuss a bit later. And there's one more question, but we'll come back to it. Thank you. So we looked at current trends. So now we'll think back into, how did we get here? Why is it that these patterns that we just talked about, that we all know, are consistent across countries, consistent across communities, particularly communities of color, and are consistent across time, right? The notion that colonization was many centuries ago, yet we're still seeing the impact today. Why? So colonialism, as defined by Merriam-Webster, is a policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over a country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. And this definition shows us the extent and the comprehensiveness of colonization as a practice, and the reason why decolonization is absolutely critical if we're going to move, if we're going to transform structures and systems that are going to be effective in seeing the change that we're looking for. So according to historians, that there are really three major waves of colonization that we think about. The first we're going to talk about two, in fact, today. We won't get into the third one. So the first wave began in the 15th century, and it was during the age of European discovery. Also, notice how language matters, right? What was colonization for colonized countries was discovery for European nation. And that's very important, because we'll see later the role that the doctrine of discovery played in really pushing and legitimizing colonization throughout the world. So during this time, European countries, Britain, Spain, France, Portugal, colonized land across Africa, particularly Portugal in the early days, South and North America. This wave of colonization led to conquest, exploration, discovery, quote unquote. Again, pay attention to language and what they mean in terms of that particular context. And this allowed these countries to rise to power between 1400 and 1750. So despite the growth of European colonies in the New World, most countries who were colonized did reach independence in one way or another between the 18th century and the 19th century, beginning with the American Revolution of 1776, and secondly with the the only successful slave-led Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1803, ending France's domination and in Haiti, which at the time was Saint-Domingue, and Haitians called it Haiti as a nod again to the native population that were disseminated completely through genocide through the first kind of advent of Spaniards on the island. So with that, there is a continuous circle between racism and colonialism, because there needed to be a justification for these actions, right? So that's when religion played a significant role in terms of really kind of this notion that it was the white man's burden, and we'll see about the white man's burden by Rudyard Kipling and the role that it played later. But this notion that it's a burden to evangelize, it's really the burden of European countries to discover and bring enlightenment and discovery to the New World, right, as the language says. So it really used race and kind of religion to justify genocide, erase the sovereignty of the people that existed in this land, justify unequal access to land, secure white property, because again, white property was there was an entitlement related to that that was not, as you can imagine, accessible for Black population or indigenous population, and the appropriation of land for slavery, chattel slavery, that will happen a bit later, and the dispossession of territory. So there is a virtuous circle that has existed from the very beginning, and we'll see later how it would become codified in law to maintain those systems and structures that we see today, unfortunately. So the third wave, the second wave, in fact, I'm sorry, the second wave of colonialism that is also worth mentioning is really called the Scramble for Africa. And the title is very apropos because it was essentially a decision by the same countries that I mentioned earlier, Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, to essentially divide the continent and arbitrarily to access the pieces of land and the resources that they wanted to take for themselves, right? So that resulted, as you can imagine, in significant disruption of political, economic, social institutions within Africa, across the continent, and traditional ways of life were completely disseminated. And we'll see as an example how that impacted nutrition. So when we talk about food security today and we talk about food systems, the drivers that have created these conditions that we see today have their roots in colonization and slavery. So by 1914, Europeans essentially accounting for about 8% of the planet's landmass, from 1492 to 1914, colonized over 80% of the entire world. So keep that in mind, 8%, 80%, because we saw this pattern a bit earlier when we looked at the current trends, and we'll see it later in terms of how economic power manifests on the global scene even today. So we talked about the system and the structure and really the justification for racism. Particularly, there was a famous figure that famous for all the wrong reasons. The Bull of Congo, King Leopold II, essentially was responsible for the genocide of over 10 million Congolese. And the effectiveness of the colonial enterprise speaks to the fact that this happened without him having ever stepped foot in Congo or in Africa for that matter. And this particular piece that you're seeing on the screen that is very difficult to read essentially was a notice that he wrote and sent to the missionaries who were going into Africa to justify and kind of strengthen and reinforce colonization in the land. And we see the dehumanization of the Black body, we see the dehumanization of Black people as a matter of fact related to colonization. So we've gone from people being considered, and particularly with native population, Bartolomé de las Casas from 1484 to 1566 was considered to be a protector of native populations, because in his early writings, he saw Black people, African people, as being more resistant, and was a great advocate for the slave trade, which would really be a turning point in the understanding of race as a factor of difference that would then lead to the further dehumanization of Black people, and then the laws that would exist later that would institutionalize racism and establish white supremacy as a structure and a system that has yet to be undermined. So from 1619 to 1865, there are a number of laws that codified everything that I've just described in terms of the systems, in terms of the dehumanization and these perspectives and biases that existed that were very important to maintain slavery. The slave codes were a set of codes that essentially governed Black body and governed the free movement, which were not free, but essentially governed the movement of quote unquote the Negroes. The Code Noir, particularly in 1685, was a French edict that really was the precursor of what would become later Black codes in America that would have similar tones in Jim Crow laws until 1965, until the Civil Rights Act. And in many ways would lead later to really, these are the underpinnings for redlining and a number of racial policies that not just in America, but really globally in different ways. And I don't want to overgeneralize because there are particular specificities to different countries in terms of how this played out. But this pattern and these types of law, as an example, in this case in North America, were quite typical across the board to maintain racism and really maintain slavery. Through chattel slavery, through the trade. So this is I'm only showing this. We won't get into it today because you can have access to it. It's available. It essentially is the evolution of race in America. And the reason why I'm showing this, if you take the time to go and kind of look at the different ways in which people were described over the years, it really goes to reinforcing the notion that race was arbitrarily used as a means to maintain power and a means to establish white supremacy. And you will see that the race would change in terms of who got to be white, who got to be Black, the one-drop rule, and so on over the decades, related to what were the stakes at the time. So it's a fascinating piece to look at. But again, we see similar patterns across the globe in many ways. As an example, in Haiti, there were a complete classification of really more than, I think, over 50 different names for people, depending on how much Black blood you had. So again, very arbitrary, really there to reinforce the colonial system and so forth. So as we kind of move into the 19th and 20th century, again, reminding us that by the 18th and 19th century, most countries, most former colonies had gained their independence in some fashion. So we see a bit of an evolution of what expansion, economic and political expansion, would look like for former colonial powers. So the basis for U.S. foreign policy, as an example, in the 19th and 20th century remained driven by this notion of manifest destiny, which essentially meant that Americans were chosen people by God to really create a model society and to create kind of a model world. And again, if we remember really what led to kind of this expansion of Europe, very similar thinking at the time. So it justified the U.S. annexion of Texas, Oregon, New Mexico, California. It really justified also the intervention of the United States across Latin America and the Caribbean, Haiti in 1915, which in fact would lead to the second time that Haiti was essentially was robbed of its gold and resources, which would become the funds and reserve for Citibank, in fact. So it's a fascinating history. And the Monroe Doctrine was also a key cornerstone for U.S. foreign policy, moving into kind of mid-1950s, which would then lead to the Truman Doctrine, which again sees the U.S. as kind of this leading power who had kind of control of this side of the globe. There is a bit of a kind of an agreement with European powers that the U.S., l'Amérique aux Américains, which really means kind of the U.S. to the Americas to America. And this would really shape the ways in which we would see the mid-19th century. So before we get into that, any questions and comments? And I see them coming. One question that I do want to raise before we get into really what this looks like over time in kind of modern times, what do you think are the legacies of colonialism and slavery, and how they shape the world we live in today? And I'm sure that many of you have great input related to that. So let's see, questions. And if there's a question we don't get to, we will get to it after the session as kind of follow-up. Let's see. So based on your experience and that of Kellogg Foundation, what resources, tools, readings have you found most effective for donors who want to better educate themselves on racial equity and philanthropy and apply it to their grants? There are significant resources that we have as a foundation. As many of you probably know, the Kellogg Foundation has done tremendous work and continues to do tremendous work in the racial equity space. And we have a number of resources that I can certainly share. Also, racial equity tools is another space for great information that really is kind of a repository of a lot of different tools that can be very helpful. And towards the end of this presentation as well, there are a number of books, and you probably see I've mentioned François, I've mentioned a number of different people towards kind of my talk, and they really are utmost scholars that give you a bit of a historical perspective and understanding as well. And I'm happy to provide more resources and help connect to my other colleagues at the foundation who are leading our DNA work as well, and who may have significant resources if you would like to see them. And there are actually some tools related to how do you apply cultivation, racial equity lens to cultivation and grant making that I've kind of put together that will also be shared with you at the end of this presentation. Thank you. So again, if we remember kind of where we started from, right? We looked at current trends. We looked at the system, the colonialism as a system and a structure, the ways in which it was codified, the evolution in the 19th and 20th century, the role that the Monroe Doctrine played and the Truman Doctrine played, and now kind of here where we are, right? So neocolonialism is considered to be late stage colonialism. And the distinction is that, if you recall, particularly colonization seeks to physically encroach into another land and take control of that space, of that land, and settle, right, or extract, because there's different types of colonization. Well, neocolonialism sees similar patterns in behavior, but through foreign and economic domination and political intervention that really you see impact, particularly, again, countries that were former colonized countries vis-a-vis kind of global north countries. So this dynamic is one that we'll see continue to evolve really over time. And we see that as an example, after 20 years, if we think about King Leopold that I just talked about in late 1800s, 1866, about 20 years later, in February 1899, very interesting story, British novelist Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem that really synthesizes well the kind of thinking of the time, which I referred to before earlier, The White Man's Burden. And essentially, in this poem, he's urging the United States to take on the burden of the empire, as had Britain and other European nations, in his word, to really kind of advance and enlighten this part of the world. So the poem coincides essentially with the beginning of the Philippine-American War that U.S. Senate had ratified, and the Treaty of Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and all of these countries were under American controls. So Theodore Roosevelt, in fact, who would become vice president later and then president, copied the poem. It's reported that he copied the poem and sent it to his friend, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, and was quoted saying, "Rather poor poetry, but good sense from the expansion point of view." So this notion again that there's an entitlement for the white men to kind of lead and expand continuously lasts and produce in the 20th century. So Manifest Destiny from that standpoint really kind of mutated into a new approach and essentially maintain those dynamics that we would see in the Americas. But again, this is not just the United States. We see similar patterns between European countries and Africa. As an example, France notably used the notion of droit d'ingérence, which really kind of yields the capacity for France under the UN to leveraging kind of the need to expand democracy and protection to enter a country and kind of enter in those types of agreements. And still yet today, African countries pay about 500 billion in colonial taxes to France each year. So again, this is not just a pattern in the United States. We see kind of the global North and the global South patterns really lasting over time and kind of late 20th century. So this brings us to about 1944. And this is a charged kind of slide, but it marks a particular moment in history that is very critical in terms of that transition from kind of colonial past to modern times. So in 1944, if you remember, really shortly before kind of the Cold War that was announced kind of with the Truman Declaration, World War II had happened. So it was at a time where European countries, including the United States, really were very worried about the progress of the Soviet Union and really the threat of communism. So it really, and also the need to kind of rebuild European countries who have been devastated from the recent World War. So it became an opportunity to really think about what would global governance look like. And global governance essentially really was kind of decided by G7, and the G7 countries are the same countries that I've mentioned, and they became G20 countries later. But at first it was France, Britain, the United States, and others who came together and essentially established three major institutions that would, the IMF, who would really monitor the flow of funds and resources and really kind of focus on supporting the trade infrastructure and really kind of maintain globalization and industrialization through those resources, right? And secondly, the World Bank, which was tasked really with kind of redevelopment and reconstruction and structural transformation. Again, at the time, the idea was industrialization was the way forward. And thirdly, trade liberalization through trade agreements, which again was intended to open up the world. Again, if we think about the patterns of the colonial past in terms of economic dynamics globally, so it was intended to open up the world for trade. But at the time, the narrative was that it was going to, through trickle-down effects, benefit all. So the set of institutions and those ideas would lead to the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus was a set of policies in the 1980s, very important, because the set of policies essentially saw fiscal discipline, tax reform, financial liberalization, open to foreign direct investment, and privatization as the package that would help countries develop. And that was instituted across Latin America, across the Caribbean, and across many African countries. And that it also set the path for development as a tool of foreign policy. If you recall what I just referred to earlier, a lot of the concern was around the expansion of communism in the Soviet bloc and how to reach those countries who needed help so that they wouldn't turn to the Soviet bloc. So foreign policy paved the way, and this package of the Washington Consensus that I've mentioned paved the way for a lot of the intervention that you would see in quote unquote third world countries, right? Again, very loaded term. So as you can see here, this is really kind of a table that's showing you the patterns of where foreign aids has evolved over the years related to foreign policy. And this is important to keep in mind because as we think about how can we be effective as philanthropy, how do we address systemic inequities across racialized communities in the world, and as we think about the global quote unquote development sector, it is important to realize and recognize that the flow of funds is following foreign policy as it was intended to do. So there's a marked distinction between the role of foreign aid, at least a primary role. I don't want to take away the secondary role that as stated, but the primary role of foreign aid dollars related to vis-a-vis to philanthropy, so that we're clear as to the waters within which we're swimming and communities are swimming as it pertains to development. So as you can imagine, everything that I've described, in fact, instead of really leading to this boom of development that was expected for quote unquote third world countries, it actually caused what we saw was the opposite. So we saw European countries and the United States, leading industrialized nation, Japan would also become part of that, continuously grow. And we saw these countries and that were kind of former colonial countries, in fact, continue to kind of step deeper into economic instability and so on. So it created a dependency, really, relationship between these two kind of global North and global South countries that we would see continue to kind of happen even today. And as you can see here, globalization and this kind of opening up of markets really profited and did well for global North countries. Again, if we remember the patterns of colonization, right, and the intent and the purpose of colonization, we see similar patterns in the relationships between kind of global South and global North countries in terms of how this opened up and benefited global North countries at really the expense of kind of global South countries at the time and really historically. So we see that as a result, Latin America and the Caribbean, here it says that it remains stagnant. I was actually argue to say that it's really kind of been in decline, because if you see the slope of that curve, it's actually kind of, pointing down. And we know the realities of kind of Central America, Latin America, the Caribbean as of now, as compared to Asia and Europe. And these are kind of broad generalization because there are a number of countries that have emerged since then, Brazil, India, and China, to kind of change the landscape a bit. But by and large, the patterns are quite similar. And Latin America and the Caribbean, particularly after the set of policies that I described, the Washington Consensus policies, really dipped. They've dipped particularly since really 2012. And we again have been unfortunately watching the news. We know the reality of many of the countries in the region today related to their economy and where they're faring vis-a-vis kind of the broader global economy. So we'll pause again for conversation and kind of question at this time. And the one question that I do want to leave you with, and this particular piece of the conversation, is how do you think that policies and structures might impact conditions for people of color and the places where you work as philanthropy, and also other actors and partners in the room who may not be in philanthropy but working in the field broadly speaking? And what levers do you identify for leverage in our work in transformational change based on kind of this pattern that we know and philanthropy as a force really within the sector? Let's see. And so questions. Based on your experience, let's see. It would be great to get a bibliography of sources you recommend in the slides you've shown throughout. Absolutely. I will share those slides, and there are a number of books references that are also towards the end that we'll also get to see. Okay, perfect. And keep bringing up the questions and your comments, so we'll make sure to address them. So we're coming to kind of the last segment and part of our conversation. So why does this all matter, right? What is the role of philanthropy? What is the opportunity for philanthropy related to these global structures that exist? And that's where a number of key pieces are important, right? Lens and narratives matter. So as we think about, again, as we just saw at really high level, the roots causes of many of the patterns that we know exist, many of the language that have evolved. So when we think about when we're engaging in conversation and partnerships with partners on the ground, it is important that we're mindful of the language that we're using related to developed countries, underdeveloped countries, global south, global north, subset, really kind of Western institution of governance as being the established norm. So there's an opportunity to question these things, right? Because they were created over time through structures and decisions and policies. So there's an opportunity for us to think about them, and to reflect about them in our work, and really to reflect on the importance of narrative for local communities, and also for our work collectively in the sector as we move forward. So I will share this particular piece, and we'll take a little bit longer here. I wanted to show an example. I know that we talked a lot of really kind of high level things. We talked about historical patterns, but this is now the opportunity to really see how these patterns and structures really impact a particular issue as an example. So this particular model is, and I can also share the resources for it, is mapping how over 400 years of history, patterns of food consumption have shifted in East Africa as a result of colonization and slavery, and really kind of historically these systems that I just described. And this model is really something that is very quite relevant for, as an example, my work in Haiti, or work in Mexico, in terms of really how these patterns come into play. So if we begin at the top, we see political economic forces that I just described as occurring over time at the broad sector in the ways in which they're impacting a particular place. So for the expansion of kind of colonial power, we see these forces really allowing colonization and kind of creating the conditions for it. And as this happens, as an example, on the right side, on the left side, we see, particularly looking at food systems in East Africa in this particular case, we see the creation of cash crop economies. So the local population who used to really engage in self-sustaining agriculture would shift those practices due to colonial colonization and the systems and structures instituted by that. And that would then lead to an ecological destruction of those places, because again, thinking about the purpose of colonization, which was massive extraction to the metropolis, a lot of the agriculture then became kind of large scale agriculture and plantation style, and really shifted the type of agricultural techniques that people were using at the time. And as this is happening, knowing that the global system is really developing international trade routes. I talked about the importance of trade and globalization for the system as a whole and the impact of that over time. It really, again, because the colonial powers were more concerned with establishing force and establishing power for extraction, seizure of arable land was routine for the purpose of the colony. Displacement of indigenous crops naturally happened as a result, and really the loss of local indigenous markets and really complete shifts of cultural practices related to food, eating, production, and agriculture. So as we kind of go, again, thinking about this over the span of 400 years of time, so as time goes on and countries become independent, and although there's still a deep relationship with Europe in this particular case, for East African countries, Belgium and France and others, we see really kind of the shift toward import substitution and export, right? Again, the continuous displacement of crops, the low quality of food imports. So countries who have the climate and people who have the know-how to produce are now depending on imports from elsewhere for their livelihood. It impacts the ways in which the family unit really lives and functions in terms of roles within those units, socioeconomic status, as you can imagine, as well as really kind of paving the way for famine because food is dependent on imports so much, and poverty is really kind of rampant at this point. And as you can imagine, the quality of food is dependent on kind of market forces. And we know the impact of kind of cheap and fast food on health. I know many of us in the room are very aware, and we see this impact on kind of children nutrition and so on and so forth. And over 400 years, you can see and imagine how this would completely disrupt food systems and everything connected to that, right? Production systems, economic activities related to that over time. So this is an analysis that is very relevant as an example in the case of Haiti. We could make a similar analysis. We could make a similar analysis in indigenous communities in Mexico as an example. And this type of analysis that really looks at how these forces impact a place over time is one that we can do across a host of issues, and which is one of the reasons why decolonization as a concept is so critical for local communities, because the idea is around how do you leverage systems change and how do you partner with philanthropy to transform these conditions so that the conditions themselves yield different outcomes. So I'll pause for any questions and comments here, and really a bit of a kind of pause and reflection, because that was quite a bit. Let's see. Time to enact alternatives that are brave spaces and led by those who have most experienced the arms of the system. What are your favorite models that light the way for us in terms of brave spaces? There's quite a bit of information related to brave spaces online. There are some nuances, but really across the board, some of the pieces are very specific, right? In terms of doing the work, in terms of not taking things personally, in terms of not challenging the realities of Black and Brown people, and also not overly relying on Black and Brown people to kind of lead the way. But these set of agreements, and the one that I've shared actually were put together in our recent Giving Circle at Need on the role of global philanthropy related to racial justice. And I can certainly share them. And if others in the room have others, please do share as well with your peers. We wish we could find an alternative for the board governance model. There's quite a bit. There's significant resources. There are significant resources related on the racial equity tools around how do you kind of use an equity lens for governance thinking. And I can certainly share. I believe that I shared a link of resources there that's focused on decolonization. But once you get there, you can actually look at the entire site, there's significant resources related to that. And I think related to the two pieces, again, going back to kind of John Powell's model, it's very important to really think about the different layers of the work in terms of the interpersonal, institutional, and so on. I know many have done significant work with their boards related to how do we think about racism, not just as kind of a thing to do, but really the impact across systems. So I'll be happy to share those pieces. And if there's any in the room who are doing this work with their board at this time, please do share so others can benefit. Thank you. And fundamentally, I think the one other piece that I would add related to power dynamics, insofar as communities are centered and people of color are centered and positions of power, that there's intentional power shifting that happens, and power shifting happens across a number of ways, right? It happens in terms of how we're leveraging our assets and resources. It happens in terms of who gets to decide, who's in a leadership position, who are we hiring within organizations to make those decisions. Where is the decision happening? Related to INGOs, what is the composition of the staff? Who's at the executive level? Or is it our white counterparts in leaders, or do we have local leaders that are in the driver's seat of decision making? So these are all key questions that are quite helpful to really test where power dynamics exist and where there may be opportunities to address these power differentials in an effective way. And I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't particularly also cite, knowing that philanthropy, particularly as a very wealthy sector, there is a natural kind of power differential related to the wealth that philanthropy holds. So as we think about that, how can philanthropy be a lever to address some of these issues? And I think with that, I will go to this particular piece that touches on that in terms of the different opportunities and role for philanthropy related to shifting power and really shifting to supporting decolonizing efforts that communities are leading. There's an opportunity to really serve as a check and balance by using voice and power to call out inequities, share knowledge, provide a platform, serve as a connector, because again, we know that access can be a tool used for power hoarding within, broadly speaking, the sector. So how do we open up access for local leaders to kind of decide for themselves and lead in the decision making, and local institutions as well to be able to do that? How do we fund local leaders and systems change effort? Again, one of the reasons why I shaped the conversation in this way is because it was really to show you the importance of systems change and addressing decolonization. Many of us are addressing very important issues in very deep ways, but knowing the structures and systems that maintain the system of inequity and how strong they are, then it's no surprise that local leadership and communities tend to approach philanthropy and their partners on the ground with more system and interconnected approaches, because unless you're really tackling the systems that are maintaining these inequities, then in many ways it feels like you're kind of running in place, right? In many ways. So systems change as a tool for decolonization to build alternative systems and structures by local leadership is absolutely something critical and something that philanthropy is particularly suited to tackle. As an example, providing unrestricted resources that support reparative action is something that we've heard many times, again, coming from actors on the ground and our Black and Brown and Latinx communities. We talked about really essentially the shift in system as a decolonization tactic broadly speaking, but also within issues. We just saw an example of what that looks like for, as an example, food systems, right? And how food systems and food insecurity became the issue that it is today because of those systems. So how do we shift and address systems change to transform them and have a tangible impact in our lifetime? Leveraging assets, payouts, and tools. Again, these different tactics will be different for different organizations, depending on where you are, depending on what you're able to do, and kind of your appetite. But these are all tools that can be used. So when we think about, we'll hear from our colleagues in the impact investment track. So how do we leverage our assets? How do we think about our fund managers so that really the decisions being made at the fund level is reflective of the needs of Black and Brown communities? How do we think about payouts in a different ways? And the different tools, grant making, PRIs that really help, again, to advance transformative system. ND and Collective, if any of you know them, they do amazing work in similar ways as well. There's an opportunity for philanthropy also to coordinate more as funders with one another to really kind of minimize the legwork for actors on the ground. That's something that we've heard quite a bit. And there's an opportunity to really fund self-determination and systems change effort in an effective way. So these are some of the, and there are many others. Really, this is a bit of kind of a snapshot of many things that I've gleaned, and I've heard from many of you who are engaged in this effort. And the Kellogg Foundation is, of course, engaged in across so many of these pieces across our work. So myself and my colleagues will be happy to connect as well. So I kind of jumped forward a little bit to answer that question, but I wanted to, and we'll share this presentation with you. I wanted to also kind of shed light on particularly what is decolonization. Again, as we looked at what colonization is, it's important to really recognize that decolonization really requires the complete shifts of mentalities in the case of the definition by Eric Ritzkes, and really kind of putting indigenous framework, indigenous meaning local leaders and local populations, Black, Brown, Latinx population, Asian populations, putting them at the center of the decision making as to what this next should look like and what the solutions should be. Sovereignty, self-determination, because we've seen dependency is a critical feature of colonialism, and it's still a feature of neocolonialism, again, today, for those who kind of ascribe to that particular thinking. And FANO, again, is a great resource that I would urge you to look into, as well as Paulo Freire, that I've kind of mentioned here, related to decolonization and these issues. So again, the opportunity for philanthropy to think about systems change as communities are really interlinked and are looking for systems change effort to transform and address these issues in an effective way. So there's an opportunity for us to really partner in that way across the issues that we're working with and with one another as funders to actually support those types of efforts. And this particular tool, I think that's many of you will like it. It really gives a bit of a snapshot of what are some key practices in racial equity that we can use in philanthropy and in racial justice to really move the needle forward. And today in the conversation, we've used about 4. So we've analyzed data and information about race and ethnicity. We looked at the structural root causes of the problems, again, keeping in mind that this is analysis that can be done across issues consistently. We named race explicitly when talking about the problems and solutions, not just the economic, political structures, but we see a pattern across race that has to be acknowledged and understood because it is a key component of white supremacy and kind of this particular structure. We also looked at and acknowledged the racial history, which is very critical and important to name it explicitly. And we talked a little bit about how do we leverage systems to address civic, cultural, political power for communities impacted, but again, not on their behalf, in partnership with, because the leadership has to come from those experts who live those realities and who have the solutions. And it's really about transforming solutions and impacting multiple systems. As we've seen, they're quite complex, and tackling them that way really does give us, it's more complicated. I will not minimize that, but it certainly does give us significant tools and really ground to see transformation. And this is just a snapshot of some organizations. It really is by no means all-encompassing at all. There are so many that are doing amazing work in the field across all types of philanthropic institution, but also intermediary institution, not NGOs, and entrepreneurial leaders and local communities. So this is by no means all-inclusive, but these are just some examples of some particular practices that certain actors are kind of advancing at this time. And if any of them are in the room, or if you know any of them and your peers, do tap them and ask questions because they are doing this work, and many others that are not mentioned as well. And the last piece that I will conclude with at this time is really this is a quote that is from one of our former trustees at the foundation, where he would always say, "Nothing about us without us." And this is really a guiding kind of principle for us in our work at the foundation, but also for me as a person. And I think it really speaks to thinking about the power that we hold and how do we continuously think about that vis-a-vis the work that we do. And there's a particular doll test for those of you who do not know about this doll test. It's a difficult thing to watch, but I do like to watch it because it reminds me of what's at stake. It reminds me of what's important. So when we feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the challenges, I think it reminds us that ultimately, if we collectively as humanity build ourselves into this place and made decision as collective humanity to get to this space, we can make decisions in a different way, because the future generation depends on it, and they deserve this effort. So I want to leave you with that particular piece. Do take a look. You can Google it. I think it's very informative, and it really goes to show again the importance of really the interpersonal when we think about racial biases and the ways in which they impact children and they impact us as human beings, which is why even though today we did not talk about interpersonal, internalized, and institutional spheres of racialization, as we think about John Powell's framework, I do urge you to take some time, look into it, look into the implicit bias test, because this work is as personal as it is institutional, as it is professional, because this is essentially the waters that we swim in, and this is the air that we kind of breathe in terms of these structures, these racialized structures and systems of inequity. So with that said, let me see. I just want to see if there are any other questions. Any other questions or comments? Oh, there's a question. There's a comment. Thank you, from Daniel Moss. Again, another example to connect with Daniel related to this. There's a comment from Daniel Moss related to the funding of indigenous Mayan communities through the Agroecology Fund in the Yucatan Peninsula. I do urge you to contact Daniel to learn more about it. They are doing very innovative work. Even as we think about how do we get resources on the ground, I think that question was one of the earlier question. And it's a question that I think Daniel and his team have found interesting ways to address in terms of taking, I'm hoping I'm not sharing too much, Daniel, but I'm sure you won't mind really taking innovative ways to receive proposals, as an example, and local languages through WhatsApp. And I think that the work that they're doing is really pushing the needle on what is possible when philanthropy is thinking about risk in a different way, to really get resources on the ground effectively. So Daniel, I thank you for your comment, and please do connect with Daniel Moss related to this work with Agroecology Fund in the Yucatan Peninsula in our work in Mexico.